Welcome to Press Review with me, Ian Martin, editor of Reaction. I'm joined by Maggie Pagano from Reaction and Alistair Benn. Press Review is the show we do every week where we take our pick of the stuff that's grabbed us in the previous 7 days or so from global media, all sorts of stories. I think we're going to go first to you, Alistair, with a pick from Unheard, I think.
Yeah, so it's a video hosted by Aris Roussenos, who's one of their contributing writers. And it's a kind of 20-minute long YouTube video of him accompanying an Insulate Britain cadre, I would call them. A sort of, I think maybe that's how they think of themselves, but he goes basically to a meeting before they do one of these. It's actually before they blocked a road coming off Southwark Bridge a few weeks ago, and he goes to a meeting they have before, and it's the most kind of in-depth thing I've seen on Insulate Britain, and kind of gets inside. The questions are good, and they give quite interesting answers to his questions, and yeah, I really recommend it just to kind of clarify. The demographic is primarily old, it's very white, and it's actually quite posh in a funny way. There's a chap called Biff, and they're all from kind of quite nice parts of England, like Cambridge or whatever. And then he kind of films the actual demo. And you kind of get a real distillation, which often emerges from these videos anyway, is of basically tradespeople trying to go to their work, which presumably, that they depend on in terms of, deadlines and people expecting you, and their frustration playing out with these protesters who are very good at being very infuriating, going limp, not moving, responding in a very high-handed way. And I thought, so it's all that. But then there was a comment that Roussenos makes, which I just didn't really agree with. And after the meeting, when they're all saying, well, we'll, if we don't do X and Y and Z in the next 1 2 years, although it's never quite clear what X, Y, and Z is, so what would, justify discontinuing these actions, he sort of goes, well, they're lovely, nice, like middle-class people. They're all really well-meaning. And I just thought, well, of course they sound nice, but let's put, I'm quite skeptical about that kind of. I think the last few years I've become quite radicalized about class and how it still affects the way we see people. And I thought, no, the message of that video, which he does point out, to be fair, at the end of the video, is that the police sort of treat them in a nice way because they're seemingly nice people, for one thing. And two, they're very articulate, they're very university educated, all that. They're very, nice, and you can imagine them at coffee mornings, whatever. But there is a huge class dimension to that. People like that get an easier ride with the institutions. The states, I mean, but in general, they get more airtime. They're listened more. Their arguments are seen as more sophisticated. And I thought, I don't think this is really about the environmental question, and it's not about what we're doing in terms of climate change, and it's nothing to do with that. I think it's a kind of, and I think, again, to give him credit, I think that's what emerges from the video, and he skillfully draws it out. But it is about a kind of identity crisis within the English middle class, and a kind of feeling of political change moving in against them, or the tides of history moving in the wrong direction.
Well, possibly. And a real but I didn't. Crisis. I mean, but also just because, being middle class doesn't make people nice. That comes across very strongly in the film. I mean, it is illuminating because it is. I mean, it's billed as Inside Insulate Britain. It's quite captivating, really, to actually listen to these people who, as you said, usually you just glimpse being dragged off the road, preventing plumbers, electricians, and people who work in supermarkets and keep the country going from getting to their work. And but I think I think you put your finger on something there, Alistair, in the way in which they're given almost too much of an easy ride because of their class status. You said that they were articulate. I know what you mean. And yes, in one level, in one sort of vacuous way, they are theoretically on a surface level articulate. But I found the level of their sort of thought process and analysis just juvenile. I mean, it would be an insult to student politicians to say that it was at a student political level. Student politics is far more sophisticated than much of the analysis on the recording, for which I don't think they were given a tough enough time. I mean, there's one guy who admits that he's paid down his mortgage, he's on his pension, he has the time, he's clearly affluent, he's done really quite well out of the whether it's the capitalist model or the mixed economy model. He's in his 70s. He has the time to disrupt other people trying to get to their job, and he describes it as preventing humanity going down the pan. That how can these people get into their cars, drive to work when they know that humanity is about to become extinct? I mean, this is sort of a childlike level of analysis about a highly complex problem, environmental damage. I mean, I think even the most, nuts or the environmentalists who'll be gathering to protest that COP26 isn't doing enough, even most of them wouldn't say that humanity is about to become extinct. Maggie, am I being too harsh?
No, I haven't seen the film, but what I'd love to know, what intrigues me, is how do we think these people, and you described, as you say, a very specific demographic, how they got to these views? Is it that they've, if you like, been radicalized by their children? Are they so affluent and well off, they don't need half-time jobs or hobbies or look after grandchildren, so they've got time on their hands? Have they been captured by this? And as you say, their arguments are really childlike, juvenile, and don't stack up. And these
it must be partly in the period that they have been adults. One of the most positive developments in global politics, and it begins arguably in the 60s, in the late 60s, maybe even earlier if you want to go back to what happened in the US in the early 20th century, the reconnection with nature. But in Western Europe in the 60s, there's a big move towards saying, actually, look, industrial development might be great, but it comes with these downsides, these costs. Look at the damage that we're doing to wildlife. All of that I think is very positive.
But that's quite different, isn't it?
It's the politics actually of the Duke of Edinburgh rather than the Prince of Wales.
Yeah.
And that process is positive. That's the backdrop to their adult lives and their working lives, as a concern for the environment. That's a positive thing. But what they manifest is a religious impulse. So it's something that is a replacement for religion, a bit like the extreme woke element as well, which is that, look, if you don't do what I say politically, and you don't buy into my argument, what you're advocating is essentially the end of humanity and Armageddon. That I have seen the truth, which gives me a sort of which gives me a kind of calm, smug certainty that I'm absolutely right. I have seen the truth. You are too stupid, or too working class, or too lower middle class, or not wealthy enough. You just haven't seen the truth. So take it for granted because I am your social superior. I have access to this truth. That then gives me a license to stop you going to work, and it gives me a license to do whatever I deem required to prevent the extinction of humanity. It's completely bonkers. But I think so. We've talked a lot about one story, and we've got 6 to get through. So I'm just going to move on to yours, Maggie. You have a story about, and there's a lot of this at the moment. There's a good piece in the Observer last week by, I think, Emma Kavanagh, about why are people feeling on edge? What is it post-crisis that has that leaves a lot of people feeling really a bit down. She's a psychologist who diagnosed it as essentially it's survivor trauma, because people have been through a pandemic and are a bit stunned in the aftermath. You wanted to highlight another piece from the New Statesman.
Yeah, another piece. It was actually last week's New Statesman, but I think it's so apposite. And I'm actually hearing the headline is, why are people so exhausted? And I'm hearing it from colleagues, friends, family members, that as they've sort of re-entered society again, everybody's exhausted, and a lot of people don't want to go out anymore. And this piece highlights a study carried out, I think, by the same psychologists that you've mentioned, Kavanagh, and others, who looked at post-disasters, but also at people, explorers who've had to live in isolation in places like Antarctica for a long time, to try and explain it. And so what the psychologist says is that the brain slows down. So when we were during lockdown, it got used to being quiet. It got used to not having lots of different experiences and impulses. And so this sort of rush to get back to normal, the brain has basically gone into overload. And that's why people are feeling tired and stressed. And she said probably the worst, the people who are feeling it the worst, who went straight in after Freedom Day and had an adrenaline rush and knocked out. And that actually that it will take some time for the brain, because the brain controls the limbic system, which is all the sort of emotional whatever. So, we should, I suppose, basically just relax. It will come back. We will be back to normal. But also accept that we have been through some sort of, quite traumatic event. So we shouldn't just say to people, don't be silly. You should be happy to be out and about. It's a real phenomenon. So
now, Alistair, I'm not attempting to turn you into a spokesman for a generation. I realized I was going to ask you there, how's your generation feeling about it? That was a completely ridiculous way to frame it. But your generation, how's it feeling about this return?
No, it's a burden to be the spokesman of the 25 to 30s.
Study says it's across generations, so you can get out of that one, Alistair. You don't have to be on this spot.
I feel I'm fit to fiddle. I feel great. I'm not tired. I'm up for it. No, everyone's knackered and exhausted, and I wonder whether, I don't think it's just. I think that that explanation is really interesting. Like that there are sort of genuine sort of physiological realities at play. Yeah. But I'm not qualified to speak about it, but I wonder if there's another sort of explanation, which is that, it's the constant ramping up. I think it was a twofold thing. It was both feeling very almost undersensitized. And I found my memory got very bad during the first lockdown. I couldn't remember, kept on having mind things and not being able to recall stuff and all that. So there's that. But then there was a sort of over sensitization on the other side, the constant ramping up of narratives and bombarding with stats and, the constant rigmarole, press conferences. And I wonder whether it's sort of even worse than the picture you're describing. It was that constant level of low-level stress, which is eventually just knackering.
Yeah. And in fact, can I just add on, because she did add that even though we are sort of almost back to normal, the threat is still there. We're still hearing the ONS numbers. We're still getting death toll, infection rates. So we shouldn't be surprised that we're still feeling a little bit under threat, because we are. There is still an invisible enemy out there. So it's good.
I was in London, obviously, a lot this week, and the reaction team were meeting, and I was at various events and things, and it felt kind of normal. There's a certain, actually, people keep going on about how damaged London is, but I think it's quite exhilarating at the moment. Actually, I can't speak for other cities. London's a focus for me at the moment, but yes, certain parts of it are bombed out, and the retail thing is changing. But I think you just get the sense of energy. I think a lot of people are really glad.
The city felt like normal yesterday.
Yeah, the city's back being busy, or certainly where we were yesterday, Maggie. But I think another factor must also just be the way in which I feel that and a lot of people report this, just their sense of time has shifted. And that must be because the things we used to do, that they were the bookmarks of the year, like the sort of trips you made to family at certain times of the year, the role that Easter played, with or without religion. Easter, the break in the summer, the way in which, yes, of course you can get sun in the UK, but that burst of foreign travel, in political terms, party conferences, all of those sort of, there were 5 or 6 pillars to your year. And actually just the problem with lockdown and COVID in general was just 1 week and 1 month being much the same as the next, which is, but I think the world is back, he said optimistically, but I've been quite bullish about that all year. My pick next, which is related to the budget, Maggie, we're talking separately about what we thought of the budget, but it's a piece from my colleague at the Times, James Forsyth, which is about Rishi Sunak's budget. Sunak pushes big state tourism to its limits. And of course, James Forsyth, political editor of The Spectator, has known Rishi Sunak for a long time, and has a very good insight into him. And James alights on something which I also thought was really strange about the budget speech, where you had 50 minutes to an hour of splashing the cash around and 150 billion pounds, endless money for everything. And then you just had this weird little coda at the end, which is a bit like Rishi saying, a big boy next door made me do it, in which he presented this critique, almost attack on the notion of big government, which he's just spent the previous 50 minutes posing with money. As James says, in his budget peroration, Rishi Sunak made his personal choice clear. After almost an hour on his feet, the Chancellor suddenly became more animated as he asserted that Britain had to get out of the COVID mindset of thinking government could solve every problem by throwing at it, even though he'd spent the previous 50 minutes throwing out 150 billion, which just struck me as kind of weird. It maybe speaks to the sense of stress and tension that Sunak feels, that he feels he's got to do this because this is a Keynesian Prime Minister, Boris Johnson. But it is I can't think of a parallel with a Chancellor who's presented a budget which he then at the end flips 180 degrees and presents an ideological counter. Maggie, we'll talk about the budget later. So I mean, let's move on to Wolfgang Bunchau's piece that you wanted to highlight.
Yeah, well, it's sort of timely with our latest fishing wars going on, which to some extent I think the way the French would say, wouldn't I, overreacting, that Macron obviously feels under great pressure. And it's quite interesting to note that in the latest polls for the next candidate for the Les Républicains party, which will be voted on in a month's time, is Michel Barnier. I'd be very interested to see what he would be doing now, how he would be treating us over the fishing. But it is interesting that he is by far and away probably the favourite to succeed, although the other chap, Xavier Bertrand, has the support of the internal party. But you've also got, so I think Barnier could be quite, if he were to win it, could be quite dangerous for Macron, actually. He does look and sound very much the elder statesman. He's toned down a lot of his rhetoric, but upped it on the, sovereignty issues like that. And at the same time, from the other side, you've got Eric Zemmour, the TV journalist, who some say is Aunt France's answer to Trump, or perhaps being kind, his answer to Boris Johnson, who is, although he says he self-identifies as a Gaullist, so he disputes this far-right tag.
Yeah.
But he hasn't declared yet, but it's likely that he will enter the ring too. So you'll have a sort of face-off between Zemmour and Le Pen, fighting for the far right, and then Barnier and Macron for the middle. So I think we're going to have some very interesting months ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. So I wanted to highlight the cover story. It's actually from last week's Spectator, Plan Z by Freddie Gray on the rise of Eric Zemmour. Freddie Gray's just terrific, really interesting piece, which makes the case. I mean, Zemmour's not remotely my cup of tea, but you can see Freddie maps out potentially, it's very early days, what might be happening is that he what he threatens to do is to, and what makes him so terrifying to the existing political class, writes Freddie Gray, is that he threatens to unite the right in an essentially conservative country. Zemmour is better positioned to sweep up the center ground too, with his culture war wizardry and his Trump Johnson-like ability to render the media apoplectic. He can always annoy the snobs enough to keep the plebs happy, but he can also woo middle and upper middle class French people, Catholics, as well as small business owners and secular liberals. As I said, not my cup of tea. Alistair, you've been watching Zemmour videos to improve your French, I think.
Yeah, well, I watch. It's not an ideological thing. I watch Macron videos as well, and anything I can. I find it's because they speak so clearly, or tend to. Macron does as well. It's really good to improve your French. But Zemmour in particular is very, very sort of quite easy to understand in lots of ways. But I find him. I honestly find him very, very intriguing. He's a very, very. He's not. I mean, this I saw an Atlantic article where it said Zemmour was, Trumpism comes to France. He's not like Trump. He's super. He's very, very clever, and that makes him very, very dangerous. And I think he's wrong about France and the nature of France, and he's wrong about France's world role, and he's wrong on in his accounts of history. And I think he's wrong about almost everything. But he's not. He knows what he's doing. He's very, very clever, and he's cleverer than Marine Le Pen by a long stretch. And he has the cunning of her father, plus the kind of ability to magically jump in tone, which Jean-Marie Le Pen didn't have. He was always very sneering, very, very aggressive. Zemmour is much, much cleverer. And I think, yeah, I look at that and I think, yeah, Freddie Gray's right there in terms of the Catholic right in France is actually quite a strong feature of French history, which it's always there. And it actually sort of little bit surfaced with the debate over when Notre Dame burnt down, because Notre Dame is seen as like the heart of France, but it's the heart of an older France than the Republic. It's a kind of soul of the last 1,000 years of French history.
Yeah.
And France is a much more, Republican values, I find them, that they're just one part of a kind of shifting historical world in France, which is kind of fascinating. But yeah, I think Zemmour, much as I find him really magnetic to watch, I find him quite terrifying, actually.
I agree, but it's a really, really good point about Notre Dame, where you could see that the argument flipped to being, because it had that position that you described, or has that position in French national life and mythology that you described. You could see the secularists also feeling some sense of ownership of the place and wanting then to try and, there were the proposals, weren't there, to remake it almost in a secular or a modern or postmodern way. And you can understand the annoyance of French Catholics saying, no, actually that space, it is a church.
Yeah. I think we also need to think a little bit about the effect of jihadist terrorist acts in France. I think has actually been quite different to the UK. It's been much more like a national, like a source of real national angst. And we all know this, but it's actually a different phenomenon in France. The killing of priests, which is repeatedly carried out, the poor teacher. It's an issue which has a very, very different, again, this is a banal thing to say, but it strikes me when Zemmour was even talking about it. It's just we have a different debate over here.
You're hitting a totally different phenomena in France, because it's the personal and cultural, because of their colonial history. You just can't compare it to the jihadism here. So 6 million Algerians and then Moroccans living in the heart of France. We don't have really anything comparable. But just going back to the Catholic point, what's really interesting that I've picked up from a lot of French friends is that a lot of people used to hide that they were Catholics the whole sort of secularism. And it's sort of, it's sort of thing you wouldn't talk about at dinner parties. Now it's much more open. And whether it's a response to the whole debate about Islam, I don't know. But it's certainly...
I think it's... Yes, similar things are happening elsewhere. And that must be a response to the rise of identity politics. That if radical groups say, look, identity is identity, and that terrible word intersectionality is everything, then existing other groups will then say, well, our identity counts. Shall we move on to the next choice, which I think, Alistair, is from you? It's about Squid Games, which you're going to have to explain to me and maybe some of the audience. I've absolutely no idea what it is, or
he's already advised us not to watch
what the story you're highlighting means.
Well, it's a South Korean television show which has been hosted by Netflix, so obviously has had a global, it's number one trending across the world.
They know what they're doing, yeah.
Yeah, and I've seen a bit of South Korean drama, and I think it's a very violent program, but a lot of South Korean films are not incredibly violent. So that's not surprising. But it's a kind of, the idea is that, people who are in debt or facing, or in debt to criminal gangs or have lost all their money, which is a huge, in South Korea, it's a massive sort of cultural thing. Being in debt, the shame of it. Also, after the financial crash, it really hit the South Korean economy very hard. And it addresses those issues. So in this game, in this sort of dystopian world, these people are offered the chance to play in a series of children's games in a kind of sealed off environment for a cash prize. So they win all the money, and then they can go back into society and pay off their debts. And the kind of big idea of the program is, although the world outside is unequal and dark, at least, and the world inside the games is very violent, because the alternative, the choice is winning or death. It's not, you don't get to draw or anything like that. At least in the world inside, you compete with a degree of equality. So it kind of makes, it's a kind of on the nose satire of modern kind of techno capitalism, basically, because the games kind of mirror, they're children's games, but the kind of logic of them often mirrors kind of real world situations in adult life, which is what gameplay often does anyway. But anyway, so
and the piece that you highlighted from The Guardian, Stuart Jeffries, is an interview with Squid Games creator. I'm not that rich. It's not like Netflix paid me a bonus, he says.
Well, it's a really good interview because he just says it's not a very profound program, which I think is great, and kind of refuses to get like that drawn into a kind of, because it isn't that profound. It's like, it is a slightly on the nose satire of, like, the kind of the rules that we play that are often perceived to be the kind of unequal rules we play it under and all that. Yeah. And then it gets extremely on the nose towards the end, to the point where it's just like, I kind of thought this is rubbish. But it does get to the heart. The program gets to the heart of something which is an interesting feature of contemporary filmmaking across the world, is people love films about games, or like about specific, in the kind of formal sense, like specific scenarios where you can game the rules in your own interest. And there's like a place you can go where you can actually win against the casino. I think people definitely feel a lot of kind of connection to that. The film Uncut Gems, which is a sort of, if you've ever seen it, it's like a defining film for our era, I think, which is set in New York and set in this kind of inveterate gambler played by Adam Sandler, who loves basketball and bets on it. That I thought was a very era-defining film. And I just wonder whether there's a kind of connection with the kind of way people really loved watching these kind of people competing in these games in a kind of sealed off place, and sort of love being that voyeur, like seeing it and seeing people fail or win. I just thought, well, this definitely gets to the heart of something.
This connects perfectly to the final item, which is for me. And you mentioned gaming there, Alistair, which is such this enormous global industry. I remember a conversation recently with asking some person who's a big investor in that space, as they say, is there not at some point, if people are going to live in this gaming universe, is there not some way of introducing news? To which he said, no, not really. There's no news applications at all. People are going to get away from the world rather than have sort of news pop up. But the thing that I wanted to mention, the final pick from me, is just a little short video. I think 2 minutes and 20 from Facebook. Must stop calling them that. What are they called? Metabook or Metaverse or whatever they've rebranded themselves as this week, which is about this new universe or metaverse which Facebook wants us to live in. And the video is just worth watching. We'll put the link to it below. Incidentally, if you're not a subscriber to Reaction on YouTube, just hit that subscribe button and also like the video, and press reviews on every week. But it's a video in which Mark Zuckerberg interviews or has a conversation with Nick Clegg, and they're trying to explain this new universe. As Helen Lewis of The Atlantic, put it, isn't it just brilliant? Here's one area of sort of human activity, human interaction, sort of basic conversation, and actually, why can't Facebook or Metaverse put itself in the middle there and monetize that? What a great thought. And the idea is that you kind of live via your glasses in a world of perpetual communication. And as Zuckerberg said in an interview with Ben Thompson on all of this, he said, isn't it great? You'll be able to still have your messages coming in on your glasses or your headset or whatever rubbish you're going to wear while you're having a conversation with someone else, and they won't actually notice. And he said this as though this is a good thing, which another blow to civility, basic human interaction, and and all the rest of it. Did you see the video, either of you?
Yeah, I did. And the exchange between Zuckerberg and Nick Clegg was just one of the creepiest exchanges I think I've ever seen. I mean, and that brings me on to my final choice.
Or just before you do, I just wanted to highlight Michael Steen saying, Michael Steen saying, it's very meta to get a Brit to do the "we aren't the baddies" bit in a video aimed at a US audience that is used to seeing Brits play the bad guys. I just find it hilarious, just considering what Clegg did to the Liberal Democrats, the destruction he wrought to the party that he led. Well, maybe now he's going to do it to Facebook or Metaverse or Metabook or whatever. But sorry, Maggie, you wanted to flag up something else.
Well, yes, I was going to flag up a piece actually on our site by David Waywell, who's just a great writer. Really, and good. He wrote this lovely sort of, what's the word? So a sort of goodbye piece, if you like, to Nick Clegg. The day before Zuckerberg announced Meta, he didn't even know this video was coming out. And as he said, the downfall of Clegg from those wonderful benign days of the Rose Garden Coalition, so much hope. This man was Deputy Prime Minister, and there he is now, facing, well, it was a period, for a lot of people, broad coalition.
Not for me.
But he has the most wonderful expression. He says he is now the apologist for an algorithm, an advocate on behalf of a complex piece of dumb code that elevates the risible over the reasonable. Anyway, it's really worth reading. But,
no, I mean, I was always a Clegg skeptic, and wasn't that keen really on the coalition. And I always thought the strangest thing about Clegg, and considering that his shtick was a kind of pious technocrat, calm, reasonable thing. How could anyone not trust him? Mm-hmm. The irony was that he became unpopular in the UK because of reversing his position on student tuition fees. Now, put to one side whether or not that's the correct position, he had campaigned. He campaigned for essentially a freeze. He campaigned against increasing tuition fees, but he had opposed that policy as Liberal Democrat leader. He'd lost the battle he'd said essentially, this is we can't advocate this policy in general election because in coalition negotiations we may have to do something different. But he still went and posed alongside all these students and stuff during the 2010 general election campaign, saying, I'm on your side against these terrible proposed increases in tuition fees, but knowing that he'd opposed it. Rather than just sort of dodging the subject, or for that reason, I've always been a Clegg skeptic. But I think we're going to wrap things up there on that note. Nick Clegg, Facebook, and there's the link to their hilarious short video below. I'm Ian Martin, editor of Reaction. You've been watching Press Review with me and Maggie Pagano and Alistair Benn from Reaction. If you're not a subscriber to Reaction on YouTube, just click the subscribe button below and also like this video. And if you're not a subscriber to Reaction on the main site and you want to read the team's journalism, get Maggie's column, my weekly newsletter on politics, which is for members of Reaction, and lots of other great stuff, including Tim Marshall, who writes every week on geopolitics, and our weekend section with book reviews, loads going on Reaction. The address is below. Hit subscribe and become a member of Reaction. Until next time, thank you for watching and listening.